The Consulting Success podcast is powered by the Clarity Coaching Program. If you'd like to work directly with the Consulting Success team and receive personal coaching and support to optimize and grow your consulting business, marketing, and revenue, visit consultingsuccess.com to find out more and apply.
Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky here, and today I'm with Larry Robertson. Larry, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Larry, you are a Fulbright scholar, founder, consultant, advisor, speaker, facilitator. You're the author of 3 books, most recently Rebel Leadership, How to Thrive in Uncertain Times. You also write recurring columns for Inc. magazine, The Creativity Post, Fast Company, and others. And then you've been running your consulting firm, Lighthouse Consulting, for almost 30 years now. So definitely want to dive, into how you've seen things change over that period of time. And you work with many well-known organizations from the likes of Visa, American Red Cross, Boston Consulting Group, and others. So today, where of course I want to get into like the work that you do and how you go about guiding organizations and their leaders to build more successful companies and organizations, and a little bit more into kind of, that prestigious Fulbright scholar. But before we do that, I always like to get started, as you know, on the podcast here, kind of the earlier years. So take us back to kind of like, what did your career look like? What did your education look like, or your path through education before you actually started your consulting business?
Sure. Like you, I think that can often be a telling starting point, understanding where somebody is now, what their origins were. And for me, I'll take it from the time up to when I began Lighthouse Consulting and doing consulting in that way. I had actually worked a number of years in what at the time was kind of a blended world of venture capital, consulting, and early stage investment banking, smaller companies going public for the first time. And I had the good fortune to work for a firm where we were tiny, and we recognized that when it came to competing to actually be the finance coordinator and the fundraiser for an organization, which was ultimately how we made our money, that we weren't going to compete with the big New York banks. They had deeper connections, deeper pockets, larger organizations. What stood out for us was, can we get to know our clients well enough that we not only can help them tell their story, not just raising money, but to their customers, to prospective employees down the line, partners, and so on. Can we do that in such a way that we really build a strong relationship underneath, which is based on this combination of, we both understand where you're trying to go as the client. We both understand also that we bring unique things. So in a way, we were consultants to these prospective investment banking or investment clients along the way. In fact, we would spend weeks, sometimes months, working with these organizations without any contract, never taking a fee or whatever, because building the relationship was so important to us. It was there in the DNA. And those were really my origins before I went into consulting. And I can tell you how I got into that as well.
Yeah, so I want to dig into that for a moment, like make it very tactical and kind of tangible for everyone. What were you actually doing? Like, how did you, so you're surrounded by much larger competitors, right? It's a pretty fierce environment. There's many different organizations that are trying to win the business of these firms that want to go public. How did you even get them to respond to your emails, to your phone calls? Like, what was the initial approach that you found allowed them to say yes to actually sitting down and having a conversation with you?
Sure. I'll give you 3 things, and the 2 first ones will kind of make you laugh. One was, we took the time to get to know them before we got the chance to get to know them, if that makes sense. We did as much research as we could on the industry they were in, although we pretty much knew those industries in many ways. We looked at the niche that they might be filling. We learned as much as we could about their organization, which is tough when they're young and small and not a lot of what they do is public. And when I was working on it in those days, this is pre-internet. You can't just go to their website or do a search or things like that. But we would really try to get to know them so that when we arrived on their doorstep, the conversation wasn't, how can you give us business? The conversation was, what can we do to raise the value of your business? So that was the first thing, that deep interest in who we were talking to before, they even took an interest in us. The second thing, and this is the part that might make you laugh, is we were arriving on their doorstep saying, let's not talk about money yet. We're not here to charge you a fee. We're not here to tell you how much money we could raise for you. We don't even know if we can raise money for you because we don't know you yet. So if you're willing to take some time to get to know us, not only does that help us to define a value proposition for how we could work with you much more specifically, but we believe you'll get value even in that process, even if you decide not to work with us. So think about that, Michael, and I know you know this. It's that if you know what the client is up to, if you have a sense of what they need, and if you're willing to give some of yourself or your firm in the beginning stages to prove that you can bring value, it's incredibly attractive. And then the third thing we brought was time. Oftentimes we would meet a client. We might even like one another. We might even see the possibility, but we could tell within the first conversation or two that the timing wasn't there yet. And so we were patient and we followed up. Many people, when they seek clients, they don't want to take the time to learn. Two, they want to start charging right away. In fact, sometimes they're watching their own bank accounts, so they feel a pressure to charge right away. And three, if there's not an ability to charge right away, they walk away. They don't come back around to see if that prospective client really has matured and could be a client. So frankly, those were the keys. And then it became the relationship. Once there was the opportunity to get to know one another, we could really express that we didn't just have knowledge or unique points of contact or unique skills. We cared about our clients, and it was abundantly clear.
You used the words, we showed up at their doorstep. Are we talking about like literally their actual doorstep? You went to their offices, or was this through some other method, like picking up the phone or sending an email? Walk us through the actual mechanics of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So again, we were in a time where we didn't have as many modes of communication as we do now, but I can tell you what the key was, and it still applies today. It was an actual conversation. So showing up at their doorstep could be a phone call, but it wasn't text. It was words, and it was emotion, and it was a chance to show that we listened. It was a chance to ask the right kind of questions, which you cannot do in an electronic exchange, which you cannot do by sending something in the mail or putting it on your website. And I mean, that's a statement. That's not a conversation. So yes, sometimes we would literally show up on their doors, usually invited, but not always.
Right.
And other times it was on the phone, but it was that interaction that we were looking for.
The image that comes to my mind right now, Larry, as you're talking and kind of describing this process that you went through, is that you would have already done a lot of research on the organization and the person before you pick up the phone to call them. And then when you called them, you would be able to actually sound intelligent because you knew some things, right? You weren't calling just to sell something. You would make a statement that would clearly indicate to them that you had done your homework, that you might be able to add some value, and then it might be worth them spending 10, 15, 30 minutes, whatever it might be, to have a bit of a deeper conversation. Is that kind of what happened, or is there anything that you want to add or change to what I just described there? I just want to make a full picture for people.
Sure. And so everything you said is absolutely true. I'll just give an ad for those that are listening. So most people don't, but anybody can do their homework. Anybody can, most people don't, think about what the value proposition is for the other side, right? Not just your services, but specifically, is there a problem you're trying to solve? Is there a place you're trying to get to? It's very specific, right? Anybody can do those things. Anybody can also do those things with a mindset that says, I'm only doing them to get an invite, or I'm only doing these things to get business. What came across, I believe, and why we were so successful is that we were sincerely interested in those people and in what they were trying to do. And really, our getting their business was always secondary. And so I can say that to you, and we could believe or not believe that, but I can also prove it to you. And I go back to the point I made earlier. Even if a prospective client said, yes, we'd like to engage with you. We'd like to teach you about our business. We'd like to have you ask unique questions about our business and what we're trying to do and our needs and how we might fill them. Once we would get started in that relationship, we weren't charging any money. I'm not saying that every consultant should be giving away their services for free. But what I am saying is that if that sincerity isn't there to say, I didn't just do a little bit of research to have a couple of points that you would recognize stand out, so I'd sound friendly to you, that's window dressing. Listen, I've learned these things about you, and I've thought about them. And I've also thought about how my skill set matches that. Here's what I've got to say. That, I think, ultimately was a difference maker.
Did the delay in charging, of kind of holding back when you actually would begin charging a client, did that ever backfire?
I'm going to say the answer to that is no, because of our expectations on the front end. So we didn't offer that time. And sometimes it was quite generous. We didn't offer that time because we thought there was a guarantee that funds would start flowing at some point. Mm-hmm. We offered that time to say, now that you and I agree there's a potential match here, let's have a window of time where we really dig in and we explore, can I bring value to you? And will you feel like the value I bring to you is more than even what you think you seek? Mm-hmm. Think about any consulting environment, any consulting arrangement. That can happen in the matter of an hour, or sometimes it takes months, years even, to build that kind of relationship and that kind of trust. So it's hard to say it backfires unless, even subconsciously, you think that, oh, well, if I give this time, it'll automatically have a financial payoff on the back end. If you believe that, yeah, then there are definitely moments where it doesn't turn into that, and we might call it a backfire. But anytime you're willing to invest more in a relationship and to show what you've got, right? To believe that what you've got is more than what you say in one conversation or even 5 meetings, right? That you still have value to give. Anytime you bet on that, I don't think you're worried so much about exactly how this will turn out. And think about it this way. There's a payoff even before they begin to pay. Every time I explain what I know, every time I explain what I can do, every time I test myself to make that match with a client, I'm honing my own skill. And I'm giving myself a free look at that prospective client, which, by the way, is a hugely valuable thing. Sometimes the backfire is you get into a relationship too quickly, too early, too deep, and then you say, oh my gosh, there is not a match here. And what I've learned over years of consulting is I'd rather know that up front. And if that costs me a little time, worth every penny.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It sounds like you and your other partners in this business had done a lot of kind of mindset preparation and the setting of expectations that helped you so that you could navigate through that. I'm wondering, Larry, you had a lot of patience in that environment where I think a lot of people these days especially don't have patience, right? The kind of the status quo or the goal that most people aim towards is success as quickly as possible, right? Looking for the shortcut, looking for the revenue, the income, the client win. Whereas the approach that you took was not, targeted to that as directly maybe as most people have in their mindset. Take me back to your earlier years, whether it was growing up in the environment that you grew up, whether it was your time in education or kind of any schooling. Is there a place that you think you could attribute that mindset to, like where you can be very mindful, be very conscious, be very patient with the setting of expectations? Because I think that is unique. It's not something that a lot of people focus on. Do you see any place that comes from in your situation?
Well, I can certainly give you reference points that were examples to me, if not an education trying to teach me those lessons. But really, everything you just described is learned. And so rather than being delivered in one lesson or from one person or experience, really learned from my own experiences over time about what makes a relationship valuable. And of course, listen, we're not stupid or silly here. Nobody's giving away the store. Everybody needs to create value for themselves. Wealth and expansion is what I've heard you and your partner cousin talk about before. But really, this is about, one of the episodes that you all did, the two of you together, was talking about your 10 guiding principles.
Right.
And one of them, interestingly, is one of the key points of the new book, Rebel Leadership, How to Lead in Uncertain Times, or How to Thrive in Uncertain Times. And that's this idea of a long-term mindset. And when you're young in your business, when you're young in your life, you just don't think that way. You may think you think long-term, but you just don't think that way. And frankly, it's learning from that experience of what happens when you don't think that way, when you aren't thinking about the long term, when you cost yourself things, an engagement is shorter than it should have been. It doesn't lead into referrals to other relationships. It doesn't lead to a lasting relationship with that client. It doesn't lead to lasting impact that you had on that client. That's when I think you start to adjust your focus and say, I've got to have this long-term mindset. Guess what comes with that? Patience. And early on in my career, come on, I wasn't patient. I mean, I might have considered myself patient, but I had no idea what patience meant. So really, it's a series of experiences, including ones that I created and then I lived through, that taught me to have that kind of patience, not just with my whole business model, But on those parts that we've talked about, I mean, that beginning that we used to have when I worked for a firm, and it was an investment firm, and we were building relationships there, that same kind of beginning, that same kind of research and investment and so on, that's exactly what I brought into Lighthouse Consulting. It's a combination of it works, so why not do it? But second, it's far more rewarding. The value that you create all the way around in your own life for your client and for, ultimately your finances is so much greater. And there's only one way to learn that, and that's to try the opposite, because the opposite doesn't work for very long.
So in 1992, you started Lighthouse Consulting. You left the firm that you're speaking with, an investment firm here. Why start Lighthouse Consulting? Why not go and find another job, do something different? What was drawing you to start a consulting business?
This story always makes me laugh. So I started Lighthouse Consulting in the middle of a job interview. I'd worked for a couple of firms in between the one that I just described. And I was looking around at opportunities in a lot of different spaces. On the side, I was doing consulting, in my mind, just to bridge the gap, to make some money in the short run, to keep my brain engaged, to keep my network engaged. So it was, I don't know, in today's terms, I guess you'd call it a side hustle on the way to something else.
Right.
So I was sitting in an interview with someone and I was describing what I was doing with my time. And what I will never forget about that meeting is that as I described how I decided to work with people in this side hustle, how I went about working with them, what kinds of things we were working on, how I was bringing a unique skill set to that and all. And here I am, I'm pitching for a job. And the woman who was interviewing me, she was behind her desk. Her chair was on wheels. She rolled it back a little bit. She put her feet up on her desk, put her hands behind her head, and started smiling at me. And for a few seconds, I let it go. But ultimately, I said, I stopped and said, why are you smiling? And she said, it sounds to me like you already have the best job you could ever have. So frankly, Lighthouse Consulting wasn't this thing that I calculated and that I knew I wanted to build. In fact, I had to have someone else, that person who was interviewing me, point out that really this was a great way to leverage skills that I had. And there was a lot of good opportunity in it. And subconsciously, I knew some of those things, but I had never pointed them the direction of having my own firm.
Have you ever gone back to that person and told her the story?
No, I never have. It's really interesting. I think about her often, and she's gone off in many career changes. In the moment, we both had a good laugh. We stopped the interview. She said, absolutely, I'm going to recommend that we should continue to consider you, but I encourage you to think about it. And she actually called back to say, listen, I'd love you to meet more of my colleagues. And I said, I don't need to. You told me where I need to be, and that's where I'm going to focus. And so I think there was that mutual appreciation of the moment in the moment.
Yeah. It probably put a smile on her face to hear this conversation right now. So
yeah.
There's not identifiable information for her to know who she is, but maybe she does. Okay. So you made the decision to make the consulting side of what you were doing a more formal business. That became Lighthouse Consulting. You were already working with some clients on the side. Take us through the initial clients that you brought on. How did you get those first few clients for the business?
So I had been part of another group that was trying to form a merchant bank. So a combination of investing and consulting, and fewer clients, you spend more time with them is the way to look at it.
Right.
And that group, I was a junior person in that group, even though ironically, I had the most experience of the people involved. And one of the partners was pointing people my way and encouraging me do whatever I wanted to call it with them, some form of consulting or advising or something like that. So I had the good fortune that occasionally he would point somebody my way. Mm-hmm. I also was in the process of looking for a job. So I'm talking to friends, not always saying, hey, is there a job available? But what are you doing? Tell me about what you're doing. Tell me about what you're working on. And so without being conscious of it, I was kind of prospecting, and some of those conversations turned into projects. Initially, my consulting was very project-based, doing some market research, doing a strategic analysis, analyzing somebody's business plan. That was kind of the zone that I was in at the time. And so I had a good sense of what it took to do a project like that, like how many hours,
right? What
was it going to cost me in terms of time and effort? And then what I've always called in consulting, what might the headache factor be for working for this particular client? Meaning, do they really know what they want? Is it going to take us some time to actually get around to it? Could there be some scope creep and they change their mind? Either way, I almost subconsciously, I knew what the work took And then I just put a price to it and I did project work. Over time, a lot of those relationships evolved from one project to another that naturally went together. Now, the way I presented them and planned them, they were finite, but they connected to one another. Those led to some retainer relationships, and some of them very long-term, because I was working with companies that were themselves growing and scaling over time. And so their needs kept changing. And my value, even though we would test it at every stage, I kept adding to it and redefining it in new ways. So I was relevant. And then on the back end, I would have some of these clients no longer need the time and the effort that I had put into them, but I had this institutional knowledge of where they were. They had my trust as an objective perspective in how they looked at their business. And so I developed these relationships. Sometimes I'd be on an advisory board. Sometimes I would be on a retainer, but it was low time involved. And eventually that defined the span of my consulting projects, long-term retainer relationships that were in depth, and then these continuing retainer relationships that were very low in time and commitment and also cost. And ever since, I've always had that arc of clients at any one time.
So there, it sounds like the early stages of your business, you were just having conversations with people in your network and you were receiving some referrals and introductions. Those are kind of the first group of clients. Work us like up one notch from that of progression of the business. What were you doing when you kind of got beyond that first stage to bring in new qualified leads and opportunities into the business? What was there a specific tactic, approach, strategy that you were using that at the early stages again was working best for you?
Yeah, a really good question. And I'll break it into two parts. The first thing is when someone introduces you to a client, at least in many of the cases I was introduced, you benefit from the trust that they're conveying, right? I wouldn't introduce you to this person unless I trusted him or her. And in reverse, I wouldn't introduce you to this prospective client if I thought they weren't going to be worth your time. You know, some of that is about trusting your network and the people who help you out there. But the engagement would often start with that. And so guess what I didn't have to do as much of? Making my own case. What was the value of my business? What was my unique selling proposition? I was given the opportunity to have a looser conversation where that came out rather than a formalized pitch. So one of the first things I did when, frankly, I just needed to fill the pipeline was I had to learn to tell my own story. What is my narrative here? How is it distinct from anything else they might see in the market? I can do lots of things, but what are the things that I do really well? Meaning, if I could create a pyramid or multiple pyramids of the things I do, which ones are paramount and which ones are really supporting so that, frankly, anybody you're pitching can remember that. And so a lot of the next stage for me was, how do I package what I'm offering so that if I don't have that introduction, I can get right in the door. The second thing I did related to that was I began to go back to the people who had hired me and I asked them for some equivalent of a testimonial. It's really interesting, especially when you're early in a consulting business. And I'm sure you know this too. You're so focused on just getting that business up and running or serving clients that you forget that that work you're doing should feed and return to you benefits on the work you'll do in the future. And among the simplest things you can do is ask somebody to write a supportive letter. That's what I did in the old days. I would get that letter of recommendation or even just a brief testimonial or something that I can cue off of to signal other people, hey, I have credibility here.
So you built up your kind of social proof, as we would call it these days, and you really honed in on, here's a lot of different things that I could provide and that I could offer, but what are the ones that I want to make more memorable, that I want to place at the forefront and that will differentiate me and create an advantage? What were you doing though in those days to actually land conversations, right? That's one of the greatest challenges that consultants have, is actually just getting to a point, like they might be very skilled, very good at what they do, but actually creating conversations with real buyers can be a challenge for some. What were you doing? How do you kind of overcome that challenge?
Yeah, it's so important. And I'm going to put this out there first. It's very personal how you go about doing that. You have to know, doesn't mean that you don't have to do things that are hard for you, but you have to know what you're good at, what fits for you, because you're likely to do more of that. And then you've got to challenge yourself to do some hard things. So for example, back in those days, I would engage. I can summarize it that way and say, I went to networking events. I went to presentations where I was an audience member, but I took the time to go up and meet the people on the stage afterwards. Why? Because I thought I could learn something from them, because I thought our networks had synergistic elements to it and I might bring something unique. So here I was really interested in learning about them and just getting to know them. But I'm networking for my business as I do that. If I was to summarize, if you think of finding ways to actively engage either in the learning or the network or finding the opportunities to tell somebody about what you do, not always a pitch, but to get the word out there in as many ways as you can so they remember who you are and that you're out there. I'd say that's absolutely critical. But here's what goes with it. You have to ask for help. So whether that's asking a prospective client for the opportunity to come in and make a formal pitch, or you're asking the person that, presented at an event you went to, you met them afterwards and you ask and say, could we have lunch sometime? I'd really love to pick your brain about such and such thing. Or it's people you know well in your network and saying to them, listen, here's where I really need some help. By the way, I've thought about how you might be able to help me, but do you think you can help me? Would you be willing to help? I was always hesitant to do both of those things. I don't like networking, at least in the old way that it used to happen, where it's very transactional. I like building the relationship kind of networking. That takes time. And the second thing I haven't liked over the years is asking for help. But you know what? It is the only way to move forward in whatever you do.
Yeah. Is there anything you tried from a marketing perspective and kind of, building your pipeline over the years that did not work for you?
Lots of things.
Give me a few things you tried that just did not come together well.
Well, it's interesting because now I not only market for my consulting business, but I market for the books that I write. And really there's overlap between the two because the subject matter I write about is entrepreneurship, creativity, leadership. And that's what my books are about as well. Well, guess what? I also consult on those things. So some of the promotional things I've done have been related to books. Sending out free copies of a book. Used to, when people looked at regular mail, I used to send something in a mail, even a postcard with a cover of the book on it. I'll tell you what this boils down to is a single lesson. I tried a lot of the things out there that I saw other consultants or other authors trying. I listened to those in the publishing industry or in associations of consultants who said, these are the things you must do. So I played around with what the typical stuff was, the traditional stuff, or even the stuff of the moment. And some of that worked for me and a lot of it didn't. And what was key was to stay tuned into two things. Why am I doing this in the first place? Like, what do I expect to come from it? And second, is it coming from it? To actually monitor your efforts to market and to try to generate business to see if they're doing what you expected them to do, not just delivering a client, but did they get you an in so you could have a meeting? Did your name, your firm, or you get more recognition? Did those testimonials reach someone's ears such that they remembered and they actually picked up the phone and called you, or they sent you an email or a text or whatever it was? So many consultants that even once they engage in marketing, number one, they look at what's out there and they assume it must be a guarantee. Two, they don't think about the reason why they're doing it other than I really should market myself. And three, they don't measure the results. You can't possibly know if you're doing the right thing if you don't do those things. And when you do those three things, you also figure out very unique ways to market yourself, things that others aren't thinking about that tend to lean towards your strengths or towards what you're already doing. And that's where the real magic happens.
One more question I want to dive into here on the marketing front before we shift to another topic. And that is, let's get current. So in 2021, looking into 2022, what are you doing today that you're finding is working best from a marketing perspective, specifically that is helping you to create more conversations with qualified buyers?
Yeah. So it's the very first one. I'm finding as many ways as I possibly can to engage. I can't tell you the number of Zoom presentations where I have nothing to do with the presenting person or group and maybe very little to do with the audience. I'm watching just to see where are people's pain points. What are they talking about there? What other resources are they referencing that I can learn from? So there's engagement even in the learning process. But I'm also participating in those sessions where there's active Q&A back and forth, meaning I'm not only signing up for the sessions, I'm asking questions so people can get to know me. I'm following up on that. And, if there's a panel of presenters in a Zoom call, I'm reaching out to them and saying, could we have a phone call or a one-on-one Zoom call so I can learn more about your business? Now, I will tell you, a lot of those feel initially like they're a decent distance from finding a consulting contract, but it's keeping me engaged. It's keeping me up to date. And frankly, a lot of them are turning into business for the very simple reason that I'm paying attention and then I'm reaching out. And there's not as much of that going on today as you might think.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're very active, in different, whether it's organizations, professional groups, you attend those, you connect with people, you send emails, you follow up. Anything else that you're doing right now from a marketing perspective, or anything that you feel excited about to try, or that you kind of feel like is going to really help the business going forward that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, it's funny. I've had a couple of things in my head as you've been asking me these questions, and I hesitated to put them out there only because I thought, well, those are kind of specific to me and to what I do. But really, that's not true. So let me give you the example and then back up from it for everybody else. As you mentioned, I write several recurring columns. I'm also a guest columnist for 4 other different publications and a few scattered here and there. Every time I write a column, it gives me a chance to put myself in front of an audience. People I know in my network, I tend to post the links to these columns in my social networking areas, a LinkedIn or a Twitter or whatever it might be. So those columns being out there gives me a presence. When I do a podcast like this, it gives me a presence and a reason to talk about what I do that actually brings value to somebody else. So for me, those articles, these podcasts, interviews, things like that have been enormously valuable for keeping me out there and bringing me prospects. The way I would bring it around to anyone is maybe it's not writing columns, maybe it's not being on a podcast, but there's some way you can take parts of what you do and what you have to offer and put it out there for the general public to see, whether it's writing for Medium on your own, or it's your own blog, or it's even the way you use your social media. That is a way to stay in front of people. That is a way to get feedback from them. And everybody has their version. It just takes work.
Yeah. Larry, it looks like you've structured your company really so that you are the brand. You're operating, delivering the services and the value for your clients. Have you ever considered building a team or having a different structure to your business? I mean, you've been doing this for 30 years. Walk us through the different thought processes and ultimately why you've arrived at the current model that you use.
Yeah, I thought about it a lot, more so in the early years. And I don't mean just like the first 1 or 2, probably through the first 15 years, I thought about it. What it came down to was, what did I want out of my business and what did I like in my business? Part of what I wanted out of my business was to be actively involved in those client engagements. That gets tougher when you build a firm. Another thing that I wanted out of it was I wanted it to be lucrative, but not just the money. I used to get bored at some points in client engagements thinking I might be doing the same thing I'd always done. And I kept asking myself, are there new ways that I can add value for this client, to think about things in a different way, to advance myself? So both of those things, wanting to be engaged actively at the client level, wanting to be able to experiment, if you will, about how I went about doing this, were much better served by staying solo. The other thing that was related to that is I know the topic of growth. What does it take to deal with growth as an organization? I'm talking about my clients. How do you anticipate it? How do you define it correctly? And how do you keep carrying it over the long term? That was my niche. So what I found over time was my clients needed other things, but they didn't need them from me. So even though my business has always been a solo operation and very oriented around strategy, I have partners. So I have partners in the marketing space. I have partners in the finance space, in the HR space, and on down the line, product development, and so on. And so my job and my focus is, how can I serve my clients best? And part of serving them best is knowing where to point them when their needs grow beyond my own. So instead of building a firm, I built this network of partners. And another benefit of that is I can have multiple partners in any one space. I then become very, very valuable to my clients because of who I can introduce them to, in addition to what I can teach them. And my value rises in their eyes because I'm not trying to make a buck on them at every turn. I'm saying, I'm trying to find you the highest value that you can get. And sometimes that isn't me. So yeah, in the early years, I thought about it over and over again. But eventually it came down to that filter of, what is it I want out of this business? How can I best get that? And I hate to say it this way, but how can I stay in my own lane enough to let my creativity and experimentation advance me there, instead of trying to become an expert where maybe I really don't belong?
Yeah. And with your referral network and these arrangements that you have, are you actively, are you providing or taking referral fees? People often wonder, like, what's the best way to structure this? And of course, there's many different ways to go about it. But what have you personally found when you are either sending a client to someone in your referral network or someone is sending business your way? Is there an exchange of percentage of fees, or what's kind of your structure and how do you approach it and think about it?
Mine is quite simple. No finder's fees, no referral fees. I get 10% of the contract you win, whatever it is. And again, I considered all those things along the way. But to me, that's a very short-term focus versus here I am back again to one of the points that you and your cousin highlight. It's about that long-term mindset. And for me, I found there's a far, far bigger payoff when you sincerely put out there that you're not trying to make a buck. You're trying to do the right thing for your client. So what I find is that the referrals come back to me in other ways, sometimes direct and sometimes indirect. And that's far more valuable and far more lucrative. So I don't do any of those fees on the upfront. And frankly, it attracts better partners to me because I think they scratch their heads for a while saying, why would you do that and not take a haircut off it? But really, it helped me weed out the herd down to those who approach their business in a similar way, including wanting to bring value to their clients. And we're actually more powerful as a network of that sort than any one of us is as a firm. And we're everyone from a single person firm up to a firm of several hundred.
We all have 24 hours in a day. For you as a solo practitioner, you have this referral network, which is fantastic, but there's only so much impact. But what I'm really getting at is there anything that you've done in your business, in the way that you deliver your services, in the way that you structure your engagements, that has allowed you to achieve greater impact, greater income, building your wealth, even though you are a solo one-person entity?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a little bit of what I described to you earlier. When I first started Lighthouse Consulting, I didn't consciously think of my buckets of consulting clients as breaking down into finite projects, more intense retainer relationships, and then ongoing retainer relationships. I didn't consciously think about it that way. Once I began to think about it that way, it defines work in a completely different way for each one of those clients. It also turned out this was like a further evolution in my understanding and my thinking. I used to think of the project as the logical entry point. And then you made your way along the continuum if the relationship went somewhere to a client who converts you to a retainer relationship and on down the line. What I found with time is that it was actually 3 different entry points. So it was things like that. It was thinking about the fact that I don't always consult in the same way to clients. How can I break that up? What does each of those models look like? How intense is the requirement of my time and my thinking and my effort in each? And it runs from, medium to high to very low. And related to that, how can I look through different entry points for getting clients and actually change who I approach and how I approach them? Even that process of how you get the client and making that more efficient can make the business more efficient and lucrative overall. So it's been things like that.
And you talk about the 3 entry points that you're using, not just one. What are those 3?
Yeah. So specific project work, and that could be clients tend to know me for, can I come in and do a strategic assessment of their team and their business model? If they are an early stage or middle stage company and they want to grow fast. And by the way, this isn't the typical company that we're talking about, but they're in my clientele. They want to pitch for money. Can I look at what they're using to pitch, their business plan, their materials, and things like that, and bring my expertise to it? Those are just 2 examples of probably half a dozen types of projects that I do where I know exactly what they require. Oh, and by the way, over time, I'm building on a wealth of knowledge from having done other projects, which makes that more efficient. So that is one type of entry point, the project type of work.
Right.
The retainer type of work, I can get that even when I haven't done a project for a client. Most often it's because I've worked with somebody in that organization before,
right?
Or there's an excellent referral who says, listen, you got to trust me. This guy knows what he's doing. He's worth every penny. Or it's just somebody who's tried everything else and they know they need somebody on their team who isn't an employee, isn't an investor, but is going to be part of that team in a more robust way. I can go pitch that directly. And then there are people who want an advisory board type of person around where I can either fill that role, or this is kind of interesting too. I help them create their definition of what does that look like? Meaning, I actually do a project for them, even though they're seeking an advisor. The project is, how do you design an advisory board that actually works, or a board of directors, or things like that? And then sometimes I will be asked to join that, and there's a payment that goes along with that. So those are examples across all 3 entry points I was talking about.
Got you. I want to then transition now, Larry, to your book called Rebel Leadership. First of all, why the title Rebel Leadership?
So it's really a new term to me made up of those two individual words, rebel and leadership. We think about rebels in certain ways, positive and negative. We think about leaders in certain ways, positive and negative. The idea here was to say, in the uncertain times in which we live, and these are deeply uncertain times, not just the last 2 years of COVID, the last 20 years have been progressively more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, as they say, a VUCA type environment. We need the best of those rebellious innovators, people who are willing to be open, people who are willing to question their assumptions, people who question all the time. We need that positive side of rebels. And we also need leaders who realize their job isn't just to sit at the top of the pyramid or to have all the answers or to play that heroic figure. It's actually to create an environment in which everybody can be a leader. So the title really comes from the combination of those two things, which are what I believe we need in this time that we're in.
You've done a lot of work studying leaders for the book and leadership. Is there anything that you learned that really stands out to you from a consultant's perspective, would be an opportunity, would be a best practice that would allow them to either engage more effectively with leaders or to support leaders in a more effective way?
Yeah, well, I wish I could say we planned this, but maybe subconsciously we were. I've thought a lot about that because the theme of these uncertain times and what that means for leadership is relevant to every single type of consultant, no matter what you're consulting in, even if it's just an awareness of the dynamic that's going on around the people you consult. So let me give you a couple of these things. First of all, if you're a consultant and working with clients and you're not starting with that statement that we live in these deeply uncertain times, and so just doing things as we've done before isn't enough, how are we going to account for this uncertainty? How are we going to account for the need to adapt? That should be a conversation you have with your clients. Even if you're not providing the solution, to make both you and your clients aware of that is to increase your odds of being successful with them and that success lasting. So that's number one, is you really are a resource for reminding them that this doesn't end when COVID ends. The second thing is that there's a bigger role for consultants to play in this uncertain environment. And I'll simplify it to say, a lot of times people look at consultants as guides. In this environment, there's a need for a guide ongoing and at every level of the organization. So as a consultant, you should think about, how can I be there over time for this client and tie it to the environment we're in, where things will change? I can't just come up or help them come up with a formula for how they should fix things, because it won't last very long in a very uncertain environment. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that if you're not thinking about what you consult on and thinking about how you can teach adaptability skills, it's time to start thinking about that. It's time to start thinking about how you can teach your clients things like, how do they infuse inquiry into everything they do ongoing? How do they leverage diversity as a key competitive advantage? And how within their organization do they co-create solutions rather than thinking of one person or one group to do it? Those adaptability skills should be in there no matter what your umbrella topic is for consulting. And the last thing that I would say is that think about how you can teach clients a framework rather than a formula, something that they can reference ongoing, whether you're there or not, that is valuable to them as their assumptions change, as their market changes, as their challenges change. And by the way, if you teach them that framework and you teach them how to use it effectively, they're never going to forget you, which means they're probably going to rehire you.
Yeah, that's a lot of golden nuggets right there. 4 really key points. I want to encourage everybody, go back, rewind, listen to this again, check the transcript if you need to. It'll be online at consultingsuccess.com, because your answers and just your thought to those questions, I feel confident will help you to identify new opportunities and ways to serve your clients and add great value that you can share in as well. So before we wrap up, Larry, a couple of additional questions for you. The first is, when you think about the habits that you employ, that you bring to life every day that are critical to your success, what are 1 or 2 things that you do on a daily basis that you just feel are really central to the success that you have?
Yeah, 2 that we haven't talked about. I mean, some we have talked about, like that engaging and asking for help, I think are critically important. But be curious and be open, and not just in the sense of problem solving. I mean, be curious in tiny ways and make it a practice, because curiosity and creativity, frankly, they're key to the human race. They're critical in uncertain times where things are changing a lot and we need the skill of adaptation. But really, they're the source of fun. And they're the source of innovation. And they're not things you can call on just in an emergency. You have to practice doing them, and they can be in the simplest of ways. So I would say that creativity and the openness that come with it are things that I try to do every day in some way, even if in the moment it doesn't seem important, because I know it pays off in the end.
Yeah, I really like those. And then in the last 6 months, what's the best book you've read or listened to? Could be fiction or nonfiction.
Oh, okay. This is perfect. I wasn't thinking about this, but I was looking at this book again today, written by a friend of mine. It's called The Tough Stuff. And this is written by a gentleman by the name of Cody Royle, Royle. He was the head coach of Australian rules football, the national team up in Canada. But he knows head coaches from all across the world. This is a book for leaders, and this is a book for those that advise leaders about what's the truth about what's the really hard part of any leadership job. And at the end of the day, we're all leaders at some level. I recommend Cody's book, The Tough Stuff, to anybody. Okay,
we'll link that up in the show notes as well. And then finally, Larry, where should people go to learn more about you, to find out more about your book?
So you can find the book on Amazon if you feel like you've heard enough that you're interested. It's Rebel Leadership, How to Thrive in Uncertain Times. But the best place to learn about me and all of my books and everything I do is my main website, my initials, LR, and the word speaks, lrspeaks.com. That's the best place to find.
Awesome. Larry, thanks so much for coming on today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
It was my privilege. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.